This is our first webinar together, so we appreciate your patience with any sort of technical issues we may have.
So just to go over our learning goals today so you know what to expect, we're hoping that our participants today will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the formative assessment process and the research base that supports the use of formative assessment, to recognize the shifting roles of the teachers and students in a formative assessment environment, and then lastly to assess current formative assessment learning opportunities offered by SDCOE to deepen your knowledge at the individual school and district level. In terms of success criteria, what we hope you'll be able to do after today's webinar is to be able to explain the why, what, and how behind the formative assessment process, to be able to articulate changes that must occur in order to implement the formative assessment process in your context, and then to be able to identify and select the most appropriate learning activities for your context. So that's what we're going to cover for today, and we hope that you walk away with, and we're going to spend the next few slides here talking about assessment and formative assessment, and just clarifying and defining terms so that we're all on the same page. This first quote from James Pellegrino and Mark Wilson is really around what assessment is and one way to picture it. If we think of assessment, it's a tool designed to observe students' behavior and to be able to get evidence or produce data to draw influences and inferences about what students know and are able to do. So in other words, it's a way of collecting information about what students know and they can do. And the reason that's important to keep in mind is because assessment essentially is a process of reasoning from evidence and answering that question of how do we know what we know about students. So if we think about a classroom context, how does a teacher know if the students have met a desired learning goal or if they've met the expectation of a particular standard? Well, we need to reason based on evidence that's collected, and that's really the function of assessment, is to get that information so that we can make informed decisions about what students know and are able to do. So what we'd like to do at this point, because the purpose today, of course, is to talk about formative assessment, is have you define, using the chat box, to define what you believe formative assessment is. So what's your definition of formative assessment? And please don't go and Google right now. We just want your best thinking at the moment. So we'll go ahead and use the chat box. We'll give you a couple of minutes to think, reflect, and type in your response. What is formative assessment? How do you define it?
So we're seeing some great responses in the chat box. All right, so we see formative assessment is assessment for learning. It's used to inform instruction and take action, deliberately used by teachers and students during instruction to provide actionable feedback to improve instruction and learning, data gathered by teachers during instruction to inform next instruction steps for individual students. Students are part of this process. Great. So it looks like we're all sort of on the same page here. So if we're thinking about assessment and formative assessment and all of the different types that we have, we really want to think of the different types in relation to the impact it has on student learning. And we know that we have the annual summative assessments, we'll have the new CASP, we'll have the new LPAC, And then all the way down to the minute-to-minute daily assessment. So formative assessment practices, and as we saw, I think that was Lori said, assessment for learning versus summative assessments, which is assessment of learning, and it's usually after a certain chunk of learning is completed. And so this characterizes all assessments from quizzes, standardized achievement tests, tutoring programs, conversations. So we see within this, we call this the wonderful cone of assessment, every type of assessment covered, but the really important part is the formative assessment practices, because that's what has the largest impact on student learning. And so the official definition that we use, because we're a smarter, balanced state, is that it's a deliberate process. It's used by teachers and students. It's during instruction. It provides actionable feedback. It's used to adjust ongoing teaching and learning strategies, and it's to improve students' attainment of curricular learning targets or goals. And so if you unpack this definition, there's a lot of key points jammed into one really long sentence here. So we see that it's, first of all, it's a process. It's used by teachers and students, so it's both have a role in this part. It's during instruction, so it's not after the learning has ended. It's supposed to be actionable feedback. It adjusts the ongoing teaching and learning. And then it's working towards some sort of predetermined goal. So just as we started with a goal, it's the learning is there, it's determined in advance, and students know what that goal is. So we love this definition that is pulled straight from the framework. It's not a tool or an event. It's not a bank of test items or performance tests. And it functions formatively to the extent that evidence about student achievement elicited by that assessment is interpreted and it's used, and that used part is very important. It's interpreted and used to make decisions about next steps in instruction. So what we see is that it's really supposed to be something that is used at the end of pulling that data. So if we gather data, we do something with it. It doesn't sit on a shelf or in a computer, and it has to be actionable. And so as we saw, it's also called assessment for learning. In the literature that you'll see in England, most of the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada as well, it's called assessment for learning, which really makes sense to us because the assessment is used to improve learning. And so you'll see the difference between the for and the of here. It's part of everyday practice. It's by students, teachers, and peers, and they should respond to that information. And so if we are looking at each of these participants, the students, the teachers, and peers, we see that each of them has a really significant and important role in this process. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this graphic. It's from Embedded Formative Assessment by Dylan William. But as we see here on the left, these are all of the different roles and different people involved in formative assessment. And at the top we see the 3 questions from Dylan William that really frame the entire learning process. So we first need to make clear where the learner is going. We then need to help students determine where the learner is now and then figure out how the learner should get there. And it is everyone's job to clarify, share, and create an understanding of the learning intentions and criteria for success. And in highly successful classrooms, we see students co-creating that criteria for success, assisting in the process of determining what those learning intentions are so that they can really understand where they are supposed to go and really by when. What's that timeline for that process?
Teachers play a distinct role in the formative assessment process because on one level a teacher does need to think in their deliberate planning process, as we saw in one of the definitions. They need to think about the instructional tasks and the activities and the learning experiences that students will be engaged in and need to think about what kind of evidence is going to be gathered aligned to the standards and the learning targets and the success criteria. So that's a very deliberate planning piece. So when we look at that middle column across the top, where it says, where is the learner now, the teacher has a very distinct and unique role of thinking about what's that going to look like during instruction, and what will students be doing, what will they be making, what will they be saying, what will they be writing that would provide evidence of their progress toward the learning target or learning goal. And then the other piece to that, the column over to the side from there, is how to get the learner there. So what do we need to do? And as a teacher, that really comes in the form of the feedback, right? So how will descriptive feedback be provided to the student around what they're making, saying, doing, or writing that's going to move them forward? So the teacher has a unique role both from the pre-planning and the lesson delivery piece to the how to provide feedback that's going to be supportive of learning.
And as we see, it's not just the teacher, it's not just the student. Peers need to activate each other's resources. So that's that peer assessment process. It's teaching each other, it's helping each other move their learning forward. And as we know, no matter how many times we explain something, if a student's not getting it, the best way is often them talking to a peer and having an explanation from someone who speaks their own language, because no matter how hard we try, we will never understand the same language as students seem to have with each other. And often students like getting feedback from each other more than adults because they can, there's a lot more of them. There's more students in the classroom, and they're the ones learning it for the first time. So we're coming from very different places. And once they are teaching each other, it really deepens their knowledge as well, because we know that highest level is being able to teach someone else about that topic. So having students work together, having students clarify learning intentions and really give each other feedback on their work truly helps move that learning forward.
As we look at the last agent involved, the student themselves, it's really this key piece of formative is how to get students to be owners of their own learning. And you'll hear terms often around agency, student agency, or self-regulation. This is really the key piece. When students understand where they're going, what the learning is around, and they're receiving feedback either from the teacher or from peers, or they're assessing their own learning as they're going, they really now are positioned to be able to take more actionable steps to move their learning forward. And this, I know as a teacher myself, a lot of times we hear, oh, we help the students with this, but they never really get it. This is the piece where, when planned well and done deliberately, students will get it. They start to understand, hey, when I did this, this happened. So let me try, doing more of that if it was successful, or if it didn't work, maybe trying a different strategy or tactic to further the learning. So when it's clear where students are to go, there are success criteria saying when you've arrived, this is what it will look like, and they're fully a part of that, then they're able to take more control of their learning and become active agents in the classroom. So the formative process, again, this chart, when we think about it, it's easy to say, oh, we just need to implement formative assessment, but there's a lot of thinking and a lot of very deliberate moves and intentionality that are included before that's going to happen. So that's really the purpose of the graphic and why we like this one, because it really brings to the front what all the components that need to be considered and planned for.
That last element, activating students as owners of their own learning, it's really important, especially once they leave the K-12 arena, because we know that once they get into higher education or out in the work world, they're going to be expected to advocate, self-advocate, to get assistance, to ask for clarification. And if they've learned that going through the schooling process, it makes that a lot easier for them to do, because we know that can be really difficult.
So again, we shared with you earlier a Smarter Balance quote around what formative assessment is as defined by the consortium. And here we have what we call the 4 attributes. This is also language from Smarter Balance. And different researchers, different folks in the formative assessment world may have 4, they may have 5. You may be familiar with certain principles of formative assessment, but we'll use the 4 that go along with the Smarter Balance system. And they're displayed here. The first one is clarifying the intended learning. And we'll get into these in a moment in a little more depth. But that's number 1. Number 2 is the eliciting of the evidence of learning. So again, what do we have that shows us what students know and are able to do? And then the third attribute is the interpreting of the evidence. Someone, whether it's the teacher, students, or peers, looking at it and then making some decisions around how close is this to the expectation. And the final piece is the acting on the evidence. What are those next steps that are taken to help move the learning forward? So here we're going into a little more depth around attribute 1. I mentioned this earlier, so clarifying the intended learning, there's really 3 key components. We have the learning goals, right, or learning intentions or learning targets. You may have different terminology for that or have heard that, but essentially, what's the key piece that this lesson or a series of lessons is designed to help get students to? And then linked very closely to that are the success criteria. How will we know when the students are there? And you've heard me say it a few times already, but what will students make, say, do, or write that would let us know then that they've met that expectation? And all of this is linked to what we call learning progressions or building blocks of learning. We know that learning develops over time, and there will be some initial understandings that students will need to participate around and demonstrate mastery, and as they move towards higher levels of understanding and deeper levels of complexity. So a learning goal initially might be a fairly low level, entry level, right? And the success criteria align to that, very straightforward. But as students progress over time through the course of a particular school year around a content area, or over time from year to year as the standards vertically articulate, those learning progressions become more complex and deep. Attribute 2, this eliciting of evidence, there are many, many ways, and just a few listed here, of how teachers and students and peers would show that evidence of learning. Everything from pre-assessments to the conversation and discussions and dialogue that happen in classrooms. The questions that teachers ask during a lesson that evoke responses from students and get them thinking about the content. The tasks, obviously, what the students are doing in the classroom, the direct observation of their work or how they're interacting and engaging with the content or one another. Obviously, digital tools and self and peer assessment. So all of these would be some examples of the evidence that would come up during the learning process that would give information around how students are progressing relative to the learning goals and the success criteria. Attribute number 3 is the interpreting of evidence, and we put in here teachers and students. Ultimately, teachers are making interpretations minute by minute during a lesson, but when we think about this is how do we engage students in that too? And this helps to pinpoint the path that students are on relative to the learning progression. So what is their trajectory of learning? Are they moving along as expected, or are there places where there are some misunderstandings or misconceptions, misperceptions? And that will come through the looking at the work itself, the examining of the work and the conversations around that work. Linked closely to that then obviously is the feedback. So feedback around the students' work, where they're doing well relative to the success criteria and they're on course, or areas where maybe they're off course and there needs to be some clarification. So having those clear success criteria lend themselves to giving meaningful feedback that will move learning forward. And lastly, the attribute number 4, this is where teachers and students act on that evidence of learning. Dylan Williams refers to it as contingent teaching and learning, right? The responses that are made, the adjustments, the monitoring, adjusting that happens is all based on the interpretation of evidence that we had in attribute number 3, and then the deliberate next steps that occur, which is attribute 4. So while we talk about these as being discrete elements, you can see how they're very closely connected and almost happening in many cases simultaneously, right? We're interpreting and giving feedback and then watching what that student does next and then providing more feedback. And so that responsive action and this notion of a cycle really underscores the entire formative assessment process. The key piece here is it's not reteaching. This isn't about giving students information, then seeing that they're not there, and then doing that lesson again tomorrow. It's really about in the moment, if we see that students are off course or students are working in a group and they notice a peer is off course, they're giving feedback and information that might clarify concepts and help students in the moment. But it is definitely not reteaching.
So we've mentioned him a few times already. So we wanted to show this quick video by Dylan Williams where he talks about making adjustments and about the formative assessment process. Not just because we love his research, but also he has a very succinct way of putting things. So as you're watching, if you want to just put a couple things that you notice in the chat box, we'll talk about it a little bit afterwards.
To me, formative assessment describes all those processes by which teachers and learners use information about student achievement to make adjustments to the students' learning that improve their achievement. So it's about using information to adapt your teaching and adapt the work of the students to put the learning back on track, if you like, to make sure that the learning is proceeding in the right direction and to support that learning. So it's what happens when you don't just lecture students and rattle through the material until you get to the end and ask them if they've understood it okay. It's constantly making those adjustments. One of the ways I like to talk about it is just imagine what would happen if a pilot flew like many teachers assess. So I flew back from Seattle a few weeks ago. Just imagine what the pilot would have done. He would have flown east for 9 hours, and then after 9 hours he'd say it's time to land. So he'll put the plane down and he'll ask, is this London? And of course, even if it's not London, he says, well, everybody's got to get off because I've got to get onto the next journey. And that's exactly the way that we've assessed in the past. We teach students material, and at the end of that teaching, we find out if they've learned it or not. And if they haven't, we say, too bad, because we're on to the next unit. So what formative assessment does is encourages teachers to take constant readings about where students are, just in the same way that a pilot takes constant readings about their position. And if the learning isn't proceeding as you planned, then you make adjustments. That's the essence, to me, of formative assessment. So the reason I think that formative assessment is the right focus is because assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It's only through assessment of some kind that you know whether what has been taught has been learned. And that's why I think this focus on this assessment process, minute by minute and day by day, not at the end of a sequence of learning, minute and day by day, allows teachers to reflect on their practice and make small steps in improving that practice in a more powerful way than anything we've seen before.
So a few things that stand out to me when I see this this video, and I think it's the same thing that Lori just wrote, that teachers and learners use the information to make those adjustments. They adapt. They keep the learning in track. Oh, I like that, Adam. Adam said, I appreciate how Del William casts teachers and students as active, interdependent agents in the learning process. And my favorite quote from this video that I use all the time is, assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. And I also use that quote when people are very unclear about what assessment truly is, and they kind of cast it in a negative light, as we see a lot in the media, and a lot of people who don't quite understand what assessment truly is. They think that a standardized assessment or testing is all that assessment is. But assessment is really just figuring out if students have learned what has been taught. And so formative assessment is really determining in the moment if students are learning what is being taught. Any other thoughts before we move on in the chat room? Type now or forever hold your fingers. Okay. So one part of formative assessment that is truly the heart of it is feedback. And we, whenever you start talking about feedback, people can usually identify a moment where they had really helpful, useful feedback, but they can identify many, many more things that were not useful and that were not helpful in moving their work forward. So when we think about effective feedback, we look at that it aligns to the content, so it aligns to the learning goals, the success criteria, and the learning progression, and that way it's very focused and helps students give feedback because they know what they are supposed to be commenting on. It also helps you move away from comments like, it was good. It is supposed to be just the right amount, which is different depending on the age group, depending on the learner. So it's enough that students can focus on prioritizing it and using that information, but it's not so much that it overwhelms. And I'm sure we can all think of a time when we've gotten so much feedback that we just didn't know where to start. It is leading to next steps, so it should be actionable. It should be something that's readily implemented by students. And students should have that time to do those next steps. And this is what the research says. It's not just my own personal beliefs, but they need to be able to make those adjustments right then in school. If it is assigned as homework, it's probably not going to happen. So that feedback needs to be actionable and utilized right then. And then it should be supporting self-regulation. So students should be taking that feedback, thinking about what their sort of patterns are for improvement, looking at what their goals should be. If you think about it, it's really like that IEP or that goal-setting process where students think about what are their next steps and how are they going to continue improving. And you really want to get them to that self-assessment point where they do the self-assessment first and they're looking over their work. Then they ask for feedback based on their self-assessment, ideally. So we focus so much on feedback because the research really supports the fact that by teaching less and providing more feedback, we increase learning just so much more. And it's really important to point out that it's both internal feedback, so there's student self-evaluation, as well as external feedback from teacher and from students, from peers, maybe parents. Really affects their knowledge, affects their belief system. We've heard a lot of research about giving praise and giving aligned feedback. So what we're really focusing on is feedback that helps them with self-regulation. So determining those next learning goals, figuring out what strategies will help them reach those goals, and producing that higher quality work. And my background before I jumped into assessment was I was a high school English teacher, and we are terrible at giving just enough feedback so that students can produce that high quality work. We are one of those types of people that will overwhelm with feedback. And I think this has been really eye-opening to me, thinking about how students can get enough information to move that work forward and focusing on the feedback that matters for that particular task. So if we have the hand-raising function on GoToMeeting, I would ask how many of you have seen visible learning or heard of visible learning before, whether it's the one that's for teachers or in general. But if you're familiar with Hattie's work, he conducted meta-analyses of just thousands of studies over time and pulled out those learning strategies that are the most effective. So if you look at the slide, it says that every child deserves at least 1 year's progress over 1 year's time, and that effect size is about 0.40. So that's just 1 year's learning. So anything above a 0.40 is an improvement. So if we're looking for feedback specifically, we can see that it's up there at 0.75. And taking a look at formative teacher evaluation, that's at 0.91. And so the reason that we focus so much on feedback, on formative assessment, and the reason that you're seeing such a resurgence of research on it is because of that obvious research-based effect that it has on improving student learning. You've probably seen research about students taking quick quizzes to assess their learning, and it's really having students give that constant feedback to themselves and to their peers that helps them move their learning forward. And the research shows that consistent, and that word is really important, I'm going to go ahead and emphasize that, the consistent use of formative strategies can double the speed of student learning. And what we see in the research is that it has the most power on those students who are furthest behind. And the research supports formative assessment for special education students and for English learners because that self-assessment really helps them in those situations where they're more likely to need that extra assistance. So the why, I think, is pretty important.
And if I can add to that also, if we think about when we spoke to the attributes earlier on, if we think about those students who are most at need in our classrooms, so students like English learners or students with special needs and others who are at risk, oftentimes they're in environments where they don't necessarily have those self-help skills. They haven't developed those strategies to advocate for themselves. And so the formative assessment process, the reason it's so significant for students such as these is that we're making the learning clear at the outset. Here's where we're headed. They become more, again, those active agents in the classroom because they understand what's happening. It's made more clear. And the feedback. If feedback is ongoing and is consistent and is, Melissa said earlier, kind of those bite-sized chunks, it helps move the students forward without overwhelming. So often our students who are farthest behind, they know they're behind, and then we give them information, well, you need to try harder, work harder. Things like that obviously demotivate students. But if we give them just the right amount of feedback and we help them understand where they're headed, where their strengths are, and where there are gaps, that's so much more empowering for the students. So I think this notion that not only can it double the speed of learning, but for those most at risk or students who are the farthest behind is because it's clarifying what is so often for them mysterious. They're waiting for someone to tell them how they're doing. And this now allows them to know they can, like Melissa said, not only self-assess, they understand the path of where they're headed.
So our goal is to keep students at the center of all of this, right? When students know where they're supposed to be going, when the learning is truly clear, they're going to be more successful. They're less likely to see it as doing school and more likely to see it as being involved in their learning. And so what you see here in front of you, these 5 statements are part of Rick Stigans' Student Bill of Assessment Rights and part of assessment literacy for students. And this wonderful design here made by our graphics team here with permission from Rick Stigans is about students being really made part of the assessment process. It's really all about ensuring that students are overall part of that learning process, that they have the why and the how to improve. They need to know the purpose. They need to know those learning targets. They need to understand what the rubric is or how they'll be evaluated before the assignment even begins. And students really have, I believe, the right to know that the assessment is reliable, it's dependable, and it's truly an effective communication of their results. So if you think about a student getting a B or an 85, what does that tell them about what they have demonstrated, about their demonstration of learning? That doesn't tell them what they need to do to improve and what they did well. It just tells them what's right or wrong. And so this really leads into creating motivation for students. If they know why they didn't do well, if they know what they did well is, on the same side of things, then they're more likely to become invested in their learning. And one thing I found really interesting in talking to teachers around formative assessment is teachers who work with the highest level or gifted students or students in AP courses, those students rarely get feedback. They're more likely to simply get a grade, and everybody needs feedback to improve. And so really by putting students into the assessment process and giving them that information, they are much more likely to move their learning forward and seek that source for improvement, whether it's the teacher, whether it's their peers, or in this age of rampant technology, a truly reliable digital source of information, not just Wikipedia.
And so this leads right into the growth mindset work, and I know so many of our districts in this region are focused on this, and really throughout the country, the notion of the mindset, right? We know that giving students grades can actually have a demotivating impact on students, right? They see the grade and then they shut down. So we want to ensure that, this is from the research of Carol Dweck, right, that we want to motivate students, and we want to have resilient students who don't think that they're either smart or they're not smart, right? It's not based on some kind of innate intelligence. We want students to understand that they have abilities and capabilities, and those are developed over time. And we truly believe, Melissa and I think the research obviously supports it in many ways, that formative practices, the formative assessment process in the classroom helps students understand this, right? That whole notion of you may not understand it yet, right? But we'll get there. And that we're going to break the learning down and provide the feedback. And through learning progressions and ongoing work, everyone can develop their skills and get better. It's not to say every single student will hit the exact same mark at the exact same point in time, and we know that's not realistic. But we can bring every student forward, and for those students who are most at risk, are underserved populations of students and students who have specific challenges, we want to increase and accelerate their learning so that we close those gaps. And again, the mindset piece underscoring that is critical. We need everyone to believe that with effort, we'll get there. And as teachers and peers, we can support one another in making that happen. And so that brings us to really the final portion of today. I mean, we gave you a bit of background about assessment in general, right, that it's a process of reasoning from evidence. We've dug into the specifics around the formative assessment process and some of the research that supports it. And now what we want to transition to is, so what can San Diego County Office of Education help do for you? And Melissa and I are here to support formative assessment practices in each and every classroom. And when we think about this is adapted from Dylan Williams' work. You notice we reference him quite a bit. When we think about effective professional learning, there's really three key components, right? There's content, process, and support. The content specifically is what we want teachers to change. What about their practice needs adjusting, and what evidence and ideas, strategies, and techniques underscore that? And then we have the notion of process. How do we go about change, right? And there's some choice and flexibility that needs to be embedded in that. We don't want teachers to feel that things are being done to them, that there's an expectation that now they have to change, right? But that this is just like with students, we as professionals learn and grow continuously. And that this happens in small steps. So just as there are learning progressions around standards for students, there are learning progressions in teachers' professional practice. And ultimately, how do we continue that change, right? This is the support component. What are those accountability pieces? What do we want to see embedded in classrooms over time? And how do we support that work through ongoing professional learning, through communities of practice, through building teachers' knowledge and expertise, and giving them opportunities to practice and fail and then try it again, just as we would want students to do in the classroom. So we believe that these three components are really a part of effective professional learning for educators.
I think one of my favorite quotes about this is that the hardest part is not getting the new ideas into people's heads. It's getting the old ones out. That's why it takes time. So it's rethinking what we know, and we learn most of what we know about teaching before we leave school. So it's trying to make sure that we unlearn the things that we shouldn't be doing.
And so when we think then through that lens of continuous improvement, we all know, we've heard this many times, that it's not that one 2-hour or a whole day workshop that we sat in where we got a nice white binder and it's sitting on a shelf somewhere. We know that true change is a process, just as a formative assessment is a process, and that for professional development to be meaningful and really change the behaviors and practices of teachers, then it needs to be ongoing. And it can't be done with just a few specific workshops around a topic. And that if we want those new practices to emerge in teachers, then that's going to take ongoing work. And it's going to take, as you see here in this quote, extensive in-service professional development. In other words, for the teachers that are in the classroom, they need to be trying things on. They need to be debriefing how those experiences went and planning with their peers. And for any of you that have participated or led lesson study models, it's a great example of teachers trying something on, getting feedback from their peers, trying it out again, making those tweaks based on what happened. And this way, if professional learning around formative practices takes on these features and these components, then we're truly going to see the change we would want.
So this is what we see as the learning cycle in professional learning. You see there's no true start or end. That we think it starts with the learning, the opportunity to practice, reflect, refine, and keep bringing new knowledge in. This might remind you of other models like Plan, Do, Study, Act, any number of other models that you're familiar with in maybe leadership work. But we'll be framing all of our work around this because we know that it's not enough just to learn the information. You need to have opportunity to actually practice it, implement it. You need to reflect on it. And that's what we're often missing. We don't give people enough time to reflect upon their learning and have that opportunity to refine. And we really want to emphasize that the formative assessment process is not just for students, it's important for teachers. So you'll see this as basically the formative assessment process, just in a slightly different context. So our upcoming professional learning, we're going to offer a menu of support. So you'll see we have 2 courses to start with, Introduction to Formative Assessment for Teachers and Introduction to Formative Assessment for Leaders, and that could be school or district leaders. And those will be 3 sessions in the fall and going into the early winter, as wintry as it gets here, with some support and virtual contact or in-person contact in between. And then we also have the San Diego cohort that I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. And then also design your own. We know that every district and every school is different, and so your needs may vary. Maybe you want to focus on a specific subject area. Maybe you have a team of teachers at one school for a certain grade level that you want to work with. But formative assessment is content agnostic. It works and it is important in every grade level and every content area. And we're happy to support you in whatever those needs are. So San Diego is a bit more of an ongoing commitment. It is based on a cohort model, so it's school site embedded. So an entire group of teachers from a school, ranging from 5 to as many as you'd want, but 5 to 15 typically, teachers going through this year-long cohort together. There'll be leadership support to start with, and that begins this summer. And the leadership, as well as a teacher leader, will learn about formative assessment concepts, think about how to lead this work, and then really develop a vision for implementing at the school level. And the reason that we focus so much on leadership is because what we've seen based on the research and based on implementations of this work across the country is that that is the key to success. Without the leadership support, formative assessment does not become truly embedded in the school site, and that improvement does not occur because once formative assessment takes hold, a lot of other things will end up changing. And then we have the teacher support, and so there'll be online learning modules to deepen the understanding of formative assessment, as well as communities of practice. And communities of practice, you may call them many different things, PLCs, but they are really school-based groups focused on one specific topic with dedicated time to just that work. And the community of practice is actually what teachers who've gone through this process before cite as the most valuable part of the work, because it's an opportunity to come together with your colleagues, talk about what you understood, what you didn't, what worked for you, what you might need more help with. And it's been called a collective struggle, which might be familiar from mathematics, Common Core math. But it's really an opportunity to think about those implementation issues and really customize the work to your specific school site. And then for teachers to just try small changes, do things like observing colleagues, supporting each other, and gathering that evidence of impact for students so that we're not consistently relying on standardized testing data to tell us everything we know about teaching and learning. And so here's a quote about communities of practice, but they're really focused on improving practice and working together as colleagues, as peers, to help move that learning forward, whether it is cross-content, whether it is grade level or focused on one content, helps move the learning forward and significantly improve student achievement.
So that concludes our presentation for this afternoon, but we do want to take some time for questions. So what we will do is we'll make the best use of the chat box, if you don't mind. any thoughts you have or questions or something we can clarify. Again, the goal of today was to give you a little bit of background, have some common language around assessment and specifically formative assessment, and then share with you some professional learning opportunities that are coming up next here through the county office. So if there are any questions, feel free to type those into the chat box.
And we will be sending the presentation as well as some informational flyers upon the conclusion. And the recording as well, the link to the recording.